interview with Sean Hogan, who is the writer-director of The Devil's Business. He also wrote and directed a segment of the horror anthology Little Deaths, and is actually going to be working on a West End play with the likes of Kim Newman this autumn. That is called the Halloween Sessions. But on August 17th, The Devil's Business is released in select UK cinemas from Metrodome Entertainment. And, here's Sean to tell us much more about it.
Okay, our first interview is with the rather wonderful Sean Hogan, writer and director of The Devil's Business. Firstly, hi Sean, how the damn hell are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. The devil's keeping me well at the moment.
Marvellous. Okay, so we spoke to you very briefly last year at Fright Fest. Firstly, can you tell us a bit about what your film's about and where you are that's different to last year? Because obviously last year, we saw it for the first time, and I gather quite a lot's happened for you since then.
Okay, well, the film is kind of sort of a hybrid film noir horror movie. It starts out more like a crime movie with two hitmen turning up at an isolated country house in the middle of the night, and they break in and they settle down to wait for their victim, their contract. And while they're waiting, one of the older men of the two begins to tell his partner a weird story about something that happened to him once. And they get interrupted, and they make some strange discoveries in the house. And then the intended victim turns up, and they attempt to go through with the hit, but it doesn't all quite go according to plan, at which point it starts to morph into more of a horror movie. Basically, we finished it a year ago. It took a while to finish because I was juggling post-production on another film, the previous film I did. So we shot it in July 2010, finished it in sort of July, August 2011. And now in July 2012, it's just about to come out. We have UK distribution with Metrodome, and they are releasing it. It's getting a small theatrical release on August 17th, and then should be out on sort of DVD and VOD and everything soon after that.
So
that's where we are, basically.
Almost a year then after the Fright Fest screening.
Almost a year after the Fright Fest screening, and 2 years after we shot the bloody thing. But that's the nature of indie films. They're sort of new and wonderful to everyone when they come out, but you've been living with them for like 2 years, and you're completely bored of them.
Oh, bless you. So what you're saying is your hand's about to fall off from shaking people's hands, and the drink offers, and all the wonderfulness that comes with being a director and so forth.
Yeah, allegedly. No, it's been great. We played quite a few festivals with it, and we had a great UK premiere, and then also in the US at Fantastic Fest. And it's just been really nice because there are very specific reasons as to why we made this film, and it's actually the smallest film I've ever made. And it's been really heartening that people have responded well to it, because I didn't really have any expectations. I did it as a palate cleanser after some bad experiences I'd had. So it's been really nice that people have actually liked it.
Oh, bless your heart. I know you also did a preview recently at, is it the Rio Cinema in London?
Yeah, that was last week. We did a sort of midnight screening in advance of the theatrical release, which was fun. That's with Cigarette Burns. Josh Sacker, who runs Cigarette Burns, was keen to give it a little preview, and so we went down there and showed it to the Dalstonites at midnight, which was fun. It seemed to go down well.
Yep, it's good, and they're a discerning crowd as far as I can gather, so this is a marker of quality.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
So what kind of films inspired that? Because obviously you said that just now that it's a film noir meets a horror movie. So obviously it's quite a unique combination. So what films, film noirs and horror movies kind of inspired you to blend the two?
I think on the sort of crime noir front there's definitely elements of stuff like The Hit by Stephen Frears. The sort of relationship between the two hitmen was kind of comes out of that. And going back to stuff like The Killers and things like that, it's just you have these sort of relationship between two hitmen, and there's always like an older, more experienced one and a younger, hot-headed one. So I think there's a real sort of noir tradition of those two characters. On the horror front, there's a lot. I mean, one of the interesting things about talking about the movie recently has been people keep coming up with, was this an influence or was that an influence? And in some cases, it's not even anything I've thought about, but when I look back at it, I kind of have to go, yeah, you know what, I love that movie and it's been in my head for years, so it probably did creep in there. The conscious ones, I mean, definitely a lot of Polanski's early films influenced me quite a lot, just the sort of claustrophobia of them and the idea that you can make an effective horror movie with just one location and a few characters. That kind of, that claustrophobia and the tension building. Yeah. Also, Val Lewton stuff for this, definitely. I always said that Devil's Business was a B movie in the best sense of the word, because when I look back at the Val Lewton movies, they're all like only 60, 70 minutes long, and they're obviously done on low budgets, but yet they turn that into an advantage, and just the way that he uses suggestion and mood to compensate for the fact that they didn't have a vast effects budget or whatever else. And I think those are lessons you can apply equally today, and that's certainly what we try to do with this.
Yeah, it's the thing I think with independent filmmaking is, of course, you've got Hollywood blowing, millions of dollars on special effects. But at the end of the day, the bare bones of filmmaking comes to script and direction and characters. I think, if you excel at those, then, you're onto a winner. And you don't need all this money.
That's what I'd hope. Traditionally the idea is that you don't necessarily need a lot of money to make horror movies anyway, because they're not star-driven or anything like that. But still, so a lot of the bigger budget ones, as you say, are driven by special effects, and even a lot of the independent stuff, they don't always seem to pay due attention to script or dialogue or anything like that, or acting, and it's just a shame because, the horror movies that I grew up on, certainly the 70s stuff, they were just so much smarter and paid attention to things like that, and it's that's something I'd like to see more of, and you do have people doing that, but they, sometimes they seem a bit few and far between.
Out of interest, do you, when you're writing and kind of devising stuff, do you do it for yourself or for the audience, in terms of how do you work out how to up the ante the whole time?
I think when you sit down to write, you're initially telling yourself the story, and whilst it's you do have to bear the audience in mind to a certain extent. Obviously, I don't write for an audience. I mean, I think it's dangerous if you try and do that, because no one really knows anything. Audiences, if you speak to sort of distributors or producers or whatever, then they'll always tell you what the audience want to see. The audience won't like this, the audience won't like that. But, I think when it comes down to it, the audience want to see something they haven't seen before, not necessarily a rehash of what they have seen before, which is not necessarily the industry way of looking at it. When I sat down to write this, the one scene in the movie that everyone talks about a lot is the monologues when the Pinner character tells this story. And when I sit down, I knew I was going to do that. I knew I wanted to have one character tell a story, and that story to sort of come into play throughout the film. But I didn't really know what it was going to be, and I just sort of sat down to write it and see what would come out. And I ended up with this 5-page monologue, and, I looked at it, I was like, well, I'm taking a chance here, but I like it, and if we get the right actor in, and, hopefully it'll play, and if it doesn't, we'll worry about that when it comes to it. But essentially, there was no way, if I'd have made this film through official channels for a bigger budget, I guarantee you the first note I would have got back would have been, take this out, it's just a guy talking for 5 pages. And that's what happens when you try and second-guess the audience, because, everyone in their infinite wisdom would have said, the audience won't sit still for that, it's boring, blah, blah, blah. And yet that's the scene in the movie that most people comment on, and that's got some of the best reactions. So, I think you're on dodgy ground if you try and keep the audience in mind too much.
I wonder, you have some enormous tonal changes in some of your films. We've, obviously, in the past, we've had things like we've had vulnerable, sexy, homeless people who turn out to be quite monstrous. We've had gangsters who refuse to die. What do you aim to achieve by these rather huge, often tonal changes?
I don't know. You can never really tell how people are going to perceive your stuff from the outside. So, you may say massive tonal changes. To me, they seem perfectly organic. I suppose you're always trying to put a little twist on things, and not necessarily in the sense of plot twists, but a lot of these sort of, horror tropes or whatever are very familiar, and you're always sort of trying to freshen them up a bit and just look at things in slightly new ways and keep it interesting for yourself. It's like, there's nothing worse than writing a script if you just feel like you're going over old ground and you're not bringing anything to the table. So I guess that's it. It's just the first person you don't want to bore is yourself. And so I'm always trying to keep things alive personally when I'm writing them. And, I like sometimes people talk about the humour in this film, and I certainly never saw myself as a comedy writer or whatever else. But sometimes bringing in elements of black humour and whatever else can be kind of interesting and spice things up a bit. So I guess there's a certain element of that. But it's very difficult for me to look at it and say essentially what I'm writing is kind of the way I see things and the way I see the world. And maybe that is a bit idiosyncratic. I don't know.
It certainly works on the comedy front. The nice thing is it gives it very much a kind of level of realism that is very much the old East End.
Yeah, I think that, again, that was something that kind of happened very organically when I was writing the script. I didn't sit down with the intention of it being this kind of like bantering comedy relationship between them, but they just sort of took over. That's the way the characters developed, and I just went with it, and it was actually gratifying watching it with an audience and seeing that the laughs are actually there. You kind of think, as a horror director, you sort of like, all right, well, I have a reasonably good feeling about the fact that I can do the horror thing, but comedy is a bit of an unknown thing for me. So when you're actually getting the laughs, it's quite nice.
It's nice to see that, in so many horror movies these days you have these cookie-cutter characters, unfortunately. It's nice to hear of, characters, at least in the writing process, that kind of evolve naturally and they go ways in which you kind of didn't expect when you sat down to create them. Yeah,
again, it just comes back to the fact that I grew up on movies that were very character-based, not just horror movies, but 70s movies in general. It was just a different time, and there were a different kind of films being made, and so for better or for worse, that's kind of in my blood. That's what formed me, and so those are the kind of movies I like to try and make. And the fact that I'm working within genre, to me, doesn't mean that I can't do that. I know that, as you say, a lot of horror movies don't really worry about that kind of thing. But to me, it's like, well, why can't you? A lot of my favourite horror movies are ones that are stronger in terms of character and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of what I'm looking to try and do.
Yeah, again, it's going back to, as you said, the horror movies of the 70s and character, and again, back to the whole, independent filmmaking. So many of the most iconic horror films, of the 70s and 80s, they were independently made. They didn't have all that money. So this goes to show, really.
Yeah, I've always kind of had a sneaking suspicion that independence is really the way to go for horror movies. There have been great studio horror movies, but equally, a lot of the really groundbreaking, risk-taking ones were made by people who just, scraped together a few bucks and went and did it because they didn't have people looking over their shoulder saying, you can't do that, that's too weird, or that's too unpleasant, or that's too shocking, And I think, horror is a genre that thrives on breaking taboos, and it's difficult to do that in an industry where, and understandably to a certain extent, where you're spending a lot of money, even on independent films. You're still spending thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds, and people do understandably get a bit worried about that. But equally, horror's not a genre that works when you play safe.
Yeah.
What kind of characters do you feel you're particularly drawn to?
I don't know. I guess kind of outsiders, morally conflicted characters. I don't write heroes and villains per se. I don't think I've ever written a horror script that had a sort of clear-cut hero in it. I tend to write shades of grey. Some people are worse than others, but certainly in the Devil's Business, they're all pretty bad. Equally, I do like writing the sort of the worst characters, the more evil characters. That they can be sort of quite delicious to write. But yeah, it just comes down to I don't want to write characters that make it easy. This is the guy in the white hat. This is the guy in the black hat. It's just interesting to me when you try and mix it up a bit. If you look at certainly what I tried to do in Little Deaths with my episode in that was, the monsters were the heroes in that, essentially. The bad guys were the nice middle class couple. So it's just, again, you're just sort of trying to sort of find interesting people to write about, and to me, interesting people are not the ones that you can reduce to sort of one level.
And what is your writing process like? I mean, as a writer myself, I always find it interesting, whether other writers, work from treatments, or if they set aside a certain time of the day to sit down and write, or.
Well, for starters, I loathe writing treatments. It's my real pet hate, and I'll always try and avoid it if at all possible. But it's difficult when someone's paying you, because they kind of want to see what they're getting. So no, I do generally tend to prepare quite a lot in terms of just making a lot of notes and thinking about things, and I'll do a sort of step outline, but that's as far as I go. I tend to know what the structure's going to be. But I just hate writing treatments. Devil's Business actually wasn't like that so much, though. For once, I did wing it a bit. I knew what the basis was, and I knew who the characters were, but I didn't necessarily know precisely what was going to happen, and it was the one time where I've sat down and written a script and kind of let the characters take me where they will, and, in this case, it really worked for me. But normally I'm a bit more prepared than that. And basically, yeah, I tend to be sort of quite disciplined about it. I'm not one of these people who sits around waiting for inspiration to strike. It's like, if I'm going to start writing a script, there will always be the sort of certain amount of prevarication, because there's nothing more frightening than an empty page. But once I start, I'll generally sort of tend to try and write between 5 and 10 pages a day, and I'll just try and power straight through it. And basically, yeah, I always make a playlist. I always listen to a lot of music while I'm writing. Again, some people need silence. I need music going while I write. And sometimes it'll come down to playing the same damn song over and over again while I write, which drives the neighbours absolutely mental. But I get into sort of quite an obsessive mindset when I'm sort of going full steam ahead.
Okay, well, we need a playlist. What is the Sean Hogan directorial playlist?
It varies from film to film. Each film has its own playlist. So, with Devil's Business, and this kind of really comes back to what happened with the music in the film, is that I'd recently been introduced to a UK band called Crippled Black Phoenix, and I was listening to a lot of their stuff, and it's very cinematic music, a lot of it, and it's clearly someone who'd been influenced by sort of film scores and all this sort of thing. So I really got into listening to them, and while I was writing, and there was one track that I kept listening to incessantly, and it finally got into my head to such an extent that I was like, we should really see if we can license this track for the movie, because otherwise this is just going to haunt me forever. And so we approached the band and sort of said, look, we haven't really got any money, but we're doing this film, and would you be willing to talk to us about using this track in the film? And essentially had a conversation with Justin Greaves, who's the band leader, and he turned around and he's like, yeah, you can use the track, wouldn't you rather I wrote an original score for you? I was like, yeah, let me think about that for just 1 minute. And so, lo and behold, Justin came on board and actually ended up writing the music, which was kind of a very, very happy accident. But that's sort of blossomed into a really nice working relationship. So that all worked out really well. So yeah, that's the process.
In terms of yourself as a writer and director, are there any habits or anything you wish you could change that you're working on in terms of your own kind of personal development?
You're always trying to get better. For me, I look forward to the day when I actually have something resembling a proper shooting schedule, because then I'll get a better idea of, what it's like to sort of sit around and have time to think about the shots properly and discuss things with the actors properly. I always feel like it's always been a mad rush up till now when I'm working. I want to keep pushing in terms of both the visuals and the performances, and just have time to really pay attention to these things, which I don't feel like I've ever quite had. I would always get the best I can get in the time, and I do a lot of prep on the look of the film, and I try and write with bearing actors in mind and write stuff they can play, but very often I don't have much time with them. We had no rehearsal time on The Devil's Business whatsoever. Jack and Billy, who played the two leads, never even met each other until we were on set. So for me, it's really just kind of about getting the budgets to an extent where I feel like I can give the best of myself.
And how long did it take you to shoot The Devil's Business?
We shot it in 9 days, which was a mad scramble. We were shooting from like 4 p.m. till 4 a.m. every day for 9 days straight. So you do kind of become slightly delirious after a while. But essentially what worked about it is that we were basically, in our own little bubble, our own little world. So everyone there was just focused on one thing, which was making the film. So, I was pulling my hair out at times, again, sort of saying, I haven't got enough time to get everything I want. I've just, sometimes you can only get the bare minimum. But it was a lot of fun to do, I have to say. And after sort of some of the recent experiences I'd had, it was really nice just to go onto a location with a group of like-minded people and just bash out a movie and for it to be fun.
That sounds uber. In terms of getting stuff like yours out there, which I'm sorry people, this needs to be seen, seriously. What do you think that the film industry can do to help guys like you?
For starters, they can stop just trying to make what was successful last year. I am heartily sick of being asked for zombie movies or found footage movies. It's like we've had enough of both of them for the time being. There have been some great ones, but equally it's like horror's capable of doing other stuff. And just because they were successful last year doesn't mean that's all you should be making. My stuff tends to be a little bit more idiosyncratic. So, I've got one script I really want to do that we're not even looking for a lot of money to do it, but it just keeps being turned down time and time again. And yet all I see is more of the same being made. I know of one quite notable director who went for a meeting about with a production company who were looking to do genre stuff. And they basically sort of said, well, we want something that's like either Buried or Paranormal Activity, because they did really well last year. And he was like, well, what, shall I make you about a movie about a guy trapped in a haunted box then? That's just that kind of mentality drives me absolutely mental. But that's unfortunately where the industry is at the moment.
Facepalm head desk, basically.
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on the current state of the British film industry?
Well, I remember when I first started thinking about making films, and there wasn't an industry. It was not something that anyone did at that point. So I'm kind of heartened by the fact that that's changed, at least. I don't know. There's one of the interesting things about going back to when I made my first movie was when I made that, I was kind of in a bubble. I didn't really know any other filmmakers or anything like that. And doing the festival circuit with that introduced me to a lot of people, both here and abroad. But it was nice discovering that there was a UK indie scene and that people were trying to make these movies, any way they could. And there are some really interesting people out there. But equally, I think it's a tough time as well. What I keep hearing from distributors is that there is no market for UK indie films at the moment. People just aren't going to see them. And every now and then you'll have something that busts out. But a lot of the time it's tough, and that obviously makes it tough to get stuff made. So it's a shame. I don't really know what the answer is, but it would be nice if people would start kind of looking a bit further beyond their local multiplex and sort of checking out what's going on in their own country, really.
Yeah. One thing that interests me is a few weeks ago I spoke to a young filmmaker from the States who had just had her film distributed in the UK, and it was financed by, I believe it was Kickstarter. So what are your thoughts towards crowdfunding or crowdsourcing?
It obviously works for a lot of people. I'm probably in danger of sounding like the sort of, grumpy old man here who's like, you damn kids, get off my lawn. For me, I feel a bit uncomfortable about it personally, but I came up basically scraping together whatever money we could do to do stuff ourselves, just by finding private money and making deals with people and all that kind of thing. And it feels a bit odd to me to actually sort of go out there cap in hand to everyone and say, give me money to make a film, guys. I'm like, I always, when I was making shorts, I basically paid for them myself. So I mean, I'm not anti it, and I know there are people out there who have done good work and deserve a bit of help. It's just every time I look at Facebook now, there's someone else sort of asking for money to do something, and I'm like, if you want to do something, just go and do it.
Yeah.
But that's times change, things are different, and it obviously has helped some good talented people. It's just not a way I choose to work, but that's because I'm getting old and stubborn, I suppose. But I don't know, maybe I'll eat my words and I'll try and do it at some point. I'm not sure.
I must admit, I think that's a very, very interesting thing to say from the sheer basis of the fact that so much, as you say, I mean, you go into Facebook and you get absolutely deluged by bucket loads of sodding things. Give me money for this, give me money for that. In terms of how the horror industry in particular is progressing, that adds one hell of a lot of peer pressure, because all of a sudden you've got about 10 different mates saying, give me money for this. Do you think it's a good thing to just get the interest in horror kind of increasing by, getting it to be this big community where it's like some of the film festivals, that is people's holiday. They will.
Yeah, I mean,
their whole deal.
It will. I mean, it will only draw attention to the horror genre in a good way if people are making good stuff. If a bunch of bad projects get funded by Kickstarter, that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the people who put money into it. It doesn't help the genre. Now I'm not saying either way that they will be bad. But it's like anything, ultimately what it comes down to is the stuff good or not? It's the same thing when, everything went digital and all of a sudden you can make a movie much more easily. And that's great because when I started out, you couldn't do that. But equally, it means a lot more bad movies are being made as well as good ones. So, there's always a flip side to these coins. It's great that stuff can get made, but essentially people need to be making good stuff.
Would you be concerned that that filmmakers go off and learn their trade, or is it just, hey, you got an idea, fella? Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way or another you do have to learn a trade. You have to pay your dues. It's not easy to make a film. It's not easy to write a script, and that sometimes people seem to think it is. The amount of people you meet who are like, oh yeah, I've written a script or whatever else. It's like, well, how many scripts did you write before you wrote that script? Because I wrote, 10 scripts that never got made before I wrote one that did, and that's probably just as well because writing a feature-length script is not easy, and and I'm still learning how to do it. There's a lot of craft involved, and the same with directing a feature, and you do sometimes meet people who seem to think it's their God-given right to go and make a film or whatever else without ever having done anything, and I'm a bit like, well, pay your dues. No one deserves this. I mean, some people can be a genius right off the bat, but most of us are not like that, unfortunately, and we need to practice a bit and we need to fail a bit. So sometimes I do worry that there's a bit of a sense of entitlement floating around.
One of the things we're going to be doing in an upcoming episode at some point is a discussion on film censorship. And what are your thoughts on censorship?
I mean, censorship for me is obviously, I grew up in the 80s. I lived through the video nasty era, and it was always a dirty word. Yeah. And it still is for me, really. I don't think that adults should be prevented from seeing anything they want to see. But luckily, certainly in the UK, we've come out the other end of the tunnel, I think. And I mean, yeah, you do every now and then something does still get banned, and I don't subscribe to that. Equally, I wouldn't always want to make any great claim for some of these films that have been banned. I mean, I sat through the Bunny Game and I was like, well, it's not very good. It's basically someone being tortured for 70, 80 minutes. I wouldn't want to see it banned. Equally, I'm not going to bang my drum and say we've lost a vital film here.
Yeah.
And I think classification is fair enough. I think giving people a bit of knowledge about what they're going to see is fine. I mean, the other thing you don't hear about a lot of the time is that when films get cut these days, a lot of the time it's a distributor asking for the cuts, because they'll go into the BBFC and they'll say, we want a 15, and BBFC will look at it and say, well, what you've got is an 18. And the distributor will say, well, we need to cut it there because we want a 15. So a lot of the cuts you get in films these days are actually distributor mandated. which is something you don't often hear about.
In terms of the way the BBFC operates, they have a particular thing about, obviously, sexual violence and representation of kids in a sexualised manner. Hence all the zillion cuts to things like the Serbian film. Do you think there are particular themes that people consider to be, that are more offensive, more supposedly dangerous and depraving than any other themes? Or, because I know obviously some of your films have incorporated things that are quite near the knuckle in a very beautiful way, I might add. Do you think there are things that are more dangerous or not?
I don't think these things are dangerous. I think they're very open to exploitation. I mean, yes, I've dabbled in that, and there's, you know, I kind of ping pong between the two really. I like doing the moody, atmospheric, subtle stuff, and then every now and then I just want to throw blood and other bodily fluids up the walls.
Bizarre.
Yes. And, you know, I see no reason why you shouldn't do that. And like I said, horror is a transgressive genre, and you should be able to break taboos and things like that. And it's just a case of how you do it. I don't think there's any subject matter that you shouldn't deal with, but it just kind of comes down to how well you're going to deal with it and how intelligently you're going to deal with it. It's too easy to sort of, you know, portray things like rape and sexual violence and whatever else in a sort of titillating, unpleasant fashion. And, you know, that really just comes down to personal responsibility. I don't think there should be anyone policing that. That's just down to individual filmmakers saying, am I doing this because I want to look at this subject matter and try and deal with it intelligently, or am I doing this because I think it's going to sell? You know, but that's the horror movie all over. You know, as a genre, it is open to various kinds of exploitation, and that's why a lot of it is junk. You know, the great stuff is great. But there's a lot of stuff being made for the wrong reasons, and the transgressive stuff, I think, is, you know, equally prey to that.
Is there anything you'd love to put in a film at some point, or, you know, that you thought, whoa, this is going to be too far?
I have one scene like that in my next film, actually, or what may hopefully be my next film, which I'm obviously not going to tell you now, but yeah, I mean, a producer read it after I'd written it, and she was very uncomfortable with one certain scene, and I was like, that scene will be the scene in the movie that everyone talks about. But so far, I mean, if you know, touch wood, all goes according to plan, we might be making that movie next year, and so far the powers that be have not said anything about that scene, so I'm kind of hoping it gets through, because the exec and the sales agent have both approved the script, and I've not had any notes about that scene back yet, so you'll just have to wait and see, but I'm hoping.
Oh, wicked. Can you give us, like, the slightest hint or anything you can think of maybe later?
No,
I can't leave it like this.
It's slightly it's an odd mixture of a sexual act and blasphemy, but yeah, beyond more than that I cannot say. But the Catholics might not be very impressed with me, put it that way.
You're a honey and I love you to pieces. Is there any film that you will not watch on sheer principle?
I don't know. On sheer principle, there's films I have no interest in seeing. Something I wouldn't watch on sheer principle would be more likely to be a terrible Hollywood movie than anything independent. I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get into name calling. There are certain movies recently that I haven't watched just because I have absolutely no interest in seeing them, and I think that the people who've made them have just made them for shabbily exploitative reasons. There's certainly one that springs to mind, but I'm not going to get into it. But yeah, generally no. Every now and then something may come along, but that's because of strongly held personal opinions and possibly personal encounters with the filmmakers.
That's not surprising. Funny question. Do you dream?
Do I dream? I am one of these people who very often doesn't remember their dreams. Every now and then I'll have a particularly distinct one that makes an impression on me. But generally, no, I don't derive a lot of inspiration from dreams or anything like that. I don't have a lot of nightmares. I've had one or two humdingers in my time, but no, not so much really.
Hunting of a Nightmare. What is a Sean Hogan nightmare?
Oh, God, I'm trying to think now. The last time I had a real cold sweat nightmare. I mean, I do remember years ago from someone who's, never made a zombie movie and has no particular interest in making one. I had a really a zombie dream a few years ago that made a real impression on me. That ended up with me being ripped apart, and it was very much, I think, came from the scene in Day of the Dead where Rose gets torn in half, and I ended up being torn in half in the dream. And I remember this feeling of my stomach dropping away, and then I woke up. So yeah, that made an impression on me. I'd say that much.
Very nice.
Oh, I wonder what that inspired.
So you're currently working on a play with Kim Newman, the Halloween sessions.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
Okay, well, that was something that came together very randomly over a drink and a chat in the pub, but sort of snowballed and became a reality very quickly. I've known Kim for a few years, and I've sort of been reading him for longer than that, so it's really great to be working with him, and a bunch of other sort of great UK genre writers as well. Stephen Volk, who wrote Ghostwatch and The Awakening last year, and a couple of novelists, Anne Bilson and Paul Macaulay, and Maura McHugh, who's a comic book writer. And yeah, basically, it's an anthology style play. It's very much in the vein of the old Amicus movies, and it's essentially deals with the main sort of framing story is set in an asylum on Halloween night, and we have a group therapy session with 5 patients telling the stories of how they came to be there. And the stories are told in different ways, but essentially the actors take on different roles in each of the stories. And then, of course, it being an Amicus-style anthology, the framing device has a payoff of its own. But I think it's going to be really great, and I can't actually announce any of the actors yet, but at the moment we have a couple of actors attached who will certainly be familiar to genre fans, who I'm very excited to be working with. And yeah, it's going to run at the Leicester Square Theatre from 29th of October to 3rd of November. It's going to be a limited run initially. We are looking into possibly bringing it back, but that will depend on how well it does. But tickets are selling fast at the moment, so anyone who wants to see it, I would say book now. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I've done bits and pieces of theatre over the years, and I've always enjoyed doing it. And the nice thing about theatre is that you don't have to spend a year raising money for it, or essentially not a show like this, which is being done sort of relatively cheaply. We just kind of put it together and we're doing it. And it was, so the whole process only took like 2 or 3 months for it to actually become a reality.
What the differences between directing, cinema and theatre?
Well, I mean, so there are certain core principles that are the same. You still want to get the tightest possible script you can. You want to get the best actors you can. But with theatre, you're obviously dealing with a more limited palette and a smaller set of tools. But you are still, and the nice thing about it is, as much as I like working on the visual side of film, it's like that's something you don't have to concern yourself when you're doing theatre. You are still trying to create pictures in a way on the stage, but you're not having to deal with all the technicalities of it. It's essentially just you, the script, and the actors to a large extent. And that's what's nice about it. I think that's why I've always enjoyed working with actors, is because I did a fair bit of theatre when I was a kid. When I was studying film, I did a lot of theatre as well. And that sort of gave me a sort of nice core education in working with actors and speaking to people about on that sort of level, which is good. So it's nice to go back and do it. I mean, I'm looking forward to trying to scare people in the theatre, because again, you obviously have a more limited means by which to do it, but equally, I think in the here and now, if you can create an atmosphere in a live environment, things can still be really scary, and I'm looking forward to playing around with that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a big audience for horror on the stage at the moment. I think The Woman in Black last year, the film, definitely got people's interest in seeing the play.
Yeah, and I've still never seen. I've seen both the film versions of Woman in Black, but I've never seen the play, and it's something I'm actually I'm probably going to go and do before our play starts its run. And obviously, you have Ghost Stories as well, which was hugely successful, and I enjoyed a lot. And we're well aware that we will probably be compared to Ghost Stories. They're both anthologies. But, what the hell? We think we're coming from a similar place of love. And what we like to say is that we're the amicus to Ghost Stories' Dead of Night. We think, Dead of Night was very much their main inspiration. And we're the amicus version.
One thing that actually I've just had a thought of, theatre, people generally seem to see theatre as a slightly more upper class thing, whereas horror seems to be very kind of, even though obviously going to cinema and that is bloody expensive, it's still got this kind of very working class feel to it. Do you think that that's something that's going to impact on audiences, or do you think they're going to say, hey, let's just go to theatre anyway, or is it going to be a kind of cultural shift thing they've got to do?
I think these things can cross over. Yes, what you're saying about theatre is right, but equally, you look back at the history of theatre and you've got the Grand Guignol and all this kind of thing. It's, there has always been an audience for this kind of stuff in a live environment. And, as we said, all you have to do is look at how well Women in Black and Ghost Stories did. I went to see Ghost Stories. It was a young audience. There were people, maybe they don't go to the theatre that often, but they were going to go and check this out because it was something a bit different. It wasn't stuffy. It wasn't middle class, and it was scary. So I just think the horror audience, which we all know there's a big audience for it, will seek things out. Will go and check something out, whether it be the theatre or whatever else. If it's going to be good and scary and that's something we certainly hope that it will be.
Wicked. I must admit, I saw a reading of M.R. James stuff at the Abattoir Festival a couple of years ago, and the absolute git that I was with insisted that we sit on the front row right in the middle. I absolutely lost it. I
really?
screamed.
At which point in the story did you lose it?
Well, there was this bit that it was the story involving there's a burial that's involved. Something's buried, and basically I'm just trying to think of which one it was without giving too much away or anything. And the guy, cause it was like one actor on stage, he'd just gone through like one of the passages really, and it was all coming back down. And then he just jumped up and went, whoa, and pointed, and it wasn't kind of loud, but by God Almighty, I shot through the ceiling. And then right at the end, when everybody was clapping, I thought everything had gone. Somebody behind me coughed. I went again. I was such a bloody thing by the end of it. I was just, it just wound me up so tightly because the entirety of the audience as well were buying into the fact this guy's obviously feeding off you. It's not like a cinema where the action is going to remain the same. But he was actively responding, and that's a beautiful thing. Having done theatre myself a lot in the past, that's a beautiful thing because you can judge and you can really pull those strings.
Well, my certainly the individual episode that I wrote of the Halloween sessions definitely has an M.R. James element to it, so so that'll be interesting.
I think that just about does it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
He left Karen with her interests peaked, I think.
Oh, that's believe me, I could go on for hours. Just how much of it we could actually show and how much we could actually answer is quite up to question.
Well, we'll have to leave something for next time.
Absolutely, because we are going to have you back,
Well, I'm very happy to do it. It was good fun. Let's say after a solid afternoon of answering questions the other day, I wasn't sure how much I'd have left to give, but this was good. This was.
This is good.
This was a bit. It's definitely a few different things thrown into it.
This is the strange one.
Well, it's like me and him together, and seriously, we talk about sexual bollocky nonsense till 4 a.m. So yes. Basically, he looks sweet and innocent, but don't let it kid you.
They're always the ones you got to look out for.
Yeah.
Exactly.